Welcome to Kansas History, a Journal of the Central Plains podcast, a collaborative project of the Kansas Historical Foundation and Department of History at Kansas State University. I am your host, Lisa Caitlin Highsmith. Today, Dr. Jim Leiker and Dr. Tai Edwards, who will be discussing the special Quindaro issue the journal published in summer 2019. Jim Leiker is a professor of history at Johnson County Community College, where he serves as the chair of the Department of History and Political Science. He is a former president of the Kansas Association of Historians and the author of numerous books and articles on the history of Kansas and the West. His book, co-authored with Ramon Powers, The Northern Cheyenne Exodus in History and Memory, was recognized as a Kansas Notable Book by the State Library Association and received the Book of the Year award in 2011 from the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He is currently co-authoring a project titled An American Crossroads, Kansans and Their Histories. Dr. Tai Edwards is an associate professor of history and the director of Kansas Studies Institute at the Johnson County Community College. She is the author of Osage Women in Power, published by University Press of Kansas in 2018. And she has worked on many projects, including collaborating with Reverend Stacey Evans on fundraising to preserve the Quindaro ruins. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Lisa, for inviting us.
Yep, thank you.
Dr. Leiker, for the benefit of our listeners, would you tell us the role of Quindaro in the state's early history?
Sure. So as all readers of Kansas history know, a lot of things happened in the year 1854. That was the year of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And if you're familiar with the whole story of Bleeding Kansas during the territorial period, there was this feud going on between pro-slavery Missourians and Free Staters and other various anti-slavery elements that were trying to turn Kansas into a free state. So what was happening along the Missouri River at that time was that the pro-slavery forces had most of the access to the river for steamboat traffic. And it was the anti-slavery group that really needed its own access to the river, and Quindaro became that access. So Quindaro is located today in the larger Kansas City metropolitan area, particularly in Wyandotte County, what we affectionately call KCK, Kansas City, Kansas. And it was on the spot that overlooks these bluffs facing the Missouri River. And so it was largely created for economic purposes, but there was this strong anti-slavery ideology that went with its founding as well. So there were a lot of notable figures who occupied Quindaro during its early years. Clarina Nichols, who was an early champion for female equality and female suffrage in Kansas, worked there on a newspaper. Some of the early figures, like Governor Charles Robinson, was involved in its development as well. What happens in this early historical period is that Quindaro peaks actually pretty early. So by about 1857, when it looks like the tide is shifting in favor of the anti-slavery movements, Quindaro sort of declines in significance. And really by 1861, by the time that Kansas becomes a state, the population has gone from something like 1,200 people down to 700. So in a lot of ways, it was one of these, it was representative, I guess, of a lot of towns that came and went in the West. It peaked early, had a lot of high hopes, boosters got excited about it, and then suddenly it's just kind of gone like dust in the wind, as my favorite rock group would say. But Quindaro's story doesn't really stop there. I mean, that continues through the rest of the 19th century. After the Civil War, African Americans who are desperate to leave the South are being drawn to Kansas because of the reputation left behind by people like John Brown, a radical abolitionist. And Quindaro's size continues to grow, especially its Black population. And one of the really interesting things that develops around 1881 is that the AME Church acquires the land for the establishment of Western University. And this is really a little known part of Kansas history that so many people just are ignorant of. But Western University was referred to as the Tuskegee of the West. It was the largest historically Black college located west of the Mississippi River. It ran from the 1880s and operated until the World War II period. And so it was really a pillar, as was Quindaro itself, for the Black community of Kansas City. And then when you get into the more recent decades, Quindaro sort of gets lost in the larger story of Kansas City's urban development. And what intrigues me about it is that most people fixate on its importance during the territorial and Civil War period, but it has this resonance that goes back way before that, and it has significance all the way to the present. So, I mean, for us, Quindaro is just central to so many aspects of American history.
What drew you both to what would become the special issue of Kansas History? Dr. Edwards, I know that you supplied numerous photos for the publication.
Well, let's start with Jim talking about, I think this might have been your idea. So start us off on how you got the idea.
I was a mere observer at the symposium. In April of 2018, there was a collaborative effort that was spearheaded somewhat by Freedom's Frontier, but also lots of local players that put together a conference at Memorial Hall in Kansas City, Kansas, titled Strength Through Numbers, the intersection of abolitionist politics, freed blacks, and a flourishing community in Quindaro. I was involved somewhat in the organization of that, but I was mostly there on that first day, on a Saturday, just to listen and observe. And somewhere in all of that, the idea struck me that this would be a great topic for Kansas history. My personal thing is I think we obsess a little too much about the period of the 1850s. This is really a story that spans 200 years. And so what if we were to put together a special issue of the journal that would touch Quindaro's past at all of these different points? That's how the idea was inspired.
For my part, when Jim and I started working on this together, my goal was to have a very representative sample of the symposium's participants and a representative sample of the communities of color that are represented in Quindaro. So, for example, John Nichols's piece, he's an adopted member of the Wyandotte Nation. He spoke at the conference about Wyandotte history and what led the Wyandottes to be in Kansas, since this isn't their indigenous homeland, which of course is a story of Indian removal, colonialism, etc. And then the work of Reverend Evans, who's Reverend of Allen Chapel, which is the church that's now affiliated with the land that Western University used to be on. She was at the conference. I met her there, actually. And the oral histories that the Kansas City, Kansas Public Library has been collecting for years. There were people that participated in that were at the symposium, and the library was promoting that at the event. And then, like Jim was saying, we wanted to not stop this history at an arbitrary point. So coming into the Western University history, the landfill history, and of course the oral histories are with people, many of whom are still living today. And all of that representative sample of that long history and of all the communities that have lived there. But your question about photos, we wanted lots of photos for the issue, of course. And there's quite a few historical images that we have in this volume, which are really great. But there's so many things in Quindaro that you can still see. And so I had an intern that was working with me, Anna Jacobson, at the time for the Kansas Studies Institute. She was the compiler of one of the oral history pieces in the journal. So she and I went out to Quindaro and met up with Reverend Evans. And Reverend Evans and I basically drove around for several hours taking pictures and trying to get a good, for lack of a cliche word, snapshot of what it looks like now, so that we can help remind people of that history. And of course, then we're documenting Quindaro, especially in this publication, permanently for what it looks like in 2019.
And you've touched on it a little, but Dr. Edwards, could you tell us a little bit more about the symposium and the people that were involved that made it all happen? Mm-hmm. And maybe what kind of stories the participants had to tell about the site?
Well, it was a 2-day long conference in April 2018, and it went fairly in chronological order. It started with the founding of the town and abolitionist history, Indian removal history, Indian Territory, Kansas, and then moved into the founding of the town, the boom bust of the town, and then its history as part of basically semi-rural Black populations in Kansas, and then the urban sprawl, the Western University. And then on the second day, I think one of the great parts about the conference is there were a lot of panels of community members that have been active in preserving this history for decades. And I thought it was a really nice job of bringing lots of community players together. So again, a lot of the people in the local community have been working on trying to elevate this history for decades. And some of the other people in the room were scholars who study this, state archaeologists, and other individuals from both Missouri and Kansas. And I think it did a really excellent job of elevating this history. It was covered a little bit on local media and bringing together people that could collaborate in new ways to push a lot of the activism that local people had been working on to push that forward. And I think for Jim and I, this volume of Kansas history is part of that work. So that symposium was really an impressive amount of content. And he and I both wanted to make sure that this existed in a permanent, scholarly, findable place. Because one of the problems, I think, for Quindaro's history is that there is just very little scholarship written about it. When someone wants to do research on any of these topics, they have a hard time even starting. And so we wanted to have peer-reviewed scholarship that people could find when they start doing this work long-term. I have photos of the program. It was really widely attended. Again, you have speakers from all across academia and from the community. Again, Wyandotte Nation members, community members who have taught in the schools in Quindaro, former journalists, archaeologists, state archivists. Jim Leiker, of course, gave the concluding remarks. They brought in scholars from across the country for events at the Kansas City, Missouri Public Library. So it was a really widespread collaborative effort to get people to Kansas City, Kansas Memorial Hall to do this event, and then also to record its history. I should also say that there were the Kansas City Boys and Girls Choir performed. There were artists who had installations there. There were poetry readings. It was really a diverse group of people.
I think all of that was recorded, and I've seen some of those available on YouTube. So.
Speaking of the concluding remarks that Dr. Edwards mentioned, Dr. Leiker, what do you think are Quindaro's most significant historical aspects or contributions? I know that's a very wide question, but if you were to pick out a few.
I think there were a lot of takeaways for me. One was that I had always approached the topic as one that was very narrow, that was narrowed to the 1850s and 60s. And as I was listening to the presentations at the symposium, I realized that Quindaro's history goes way back before 1854. I was struck by all of the politics that were involved in the acquisition of the land from the Wyandotte people. I was intrigued by all of these themes of people finding freedom in an area that was already claimed by Native people. John Nichols' piece, I think, speaks especially to the role of the Second Great Awakening in this, that various tribal people back east and their churches were split over the question of slavery, and they carry some of those divisions with them when they come to Quindaro. I've always thought that the story needs to begin much earlier, back to the very first European explorers and before that, who were on that spot and certainly would have used it to observe activity on the river. I guess another important takeaway for me is that the story also needs to come closer to the present. It's amazing that the history of Kansas City, Missouri, at least Black Kansas City, that we think we know so well, the story of jazz, meatpacking, the Kansas City Monarchs, 18th and Vine. Most people are familiar with those in a basic way, but we've never really heard how that's spilled over onto the Kansas side in a place like Quindaro. Paul Wentz's piece really speaks to the strong music department that they had at Western University. The Jackson Jubilee Singers traveled all over the country. It produced artists like Etta Moten, who played at the White House. Surely there had to have been overlap between that and the music scene that was happening on the Pendergast side of Kansas City. So I would really like to see Quindaro's history somehow be integrated into that larger story. I guess the takeaways is that it's a much broader, bigger picture than we've, as scholars, have given it credit for. I guess I'll say this too. Something that really surprised me was how even members of the community didn't really know much about their own history prior to 30 or 40 years ago when the landfill controversy erupted. It's amazing that even in a place where people live very local lives and they're surrounded by these ruins, that there's a kind of veil that clouds their vision as to what went on back in the past. Quindaro has developed a reputation as being an important center on the Underground Railroad, and because of that, it's become all intertwined with Kansas's Free State narrative. In fact, if you get into the historical documents, the first mention of Quindaro as a sanctuary for runaway slaves doesn't seem to pop up anywhere until Clarina Nichols mentions it in the 1880s. And so there's a lot of speculation that the whole role of Quindaro in the freedom narrative has probably been exaggerated. Now, I would argue that doesn't exactly take away from its importance, because the myths the local stories that have been attached to it certainly live on. And I also think that there are a whole lot of other stories of Native people, urban development, infrastructure that we also should be talking about. Quindaro is like a microcosm for all of these important things. We've been focusing on one or two.
Fred Whitehead's article tells us there's been quite a struggle behind saving the Quindaro site. Could you tell our listeners some points about that and the eventual ultimate success of it becoming a National Historic Site?
Yeah, so in the 80s, and there's this great piece from Fred in the journal, which I think is another classic example of some scholarship that needed to be written, and firsthand because he participated in it. So it functions in some ways as a primary source. The community identity in Quindaro that we think of today was solidified, and maybe some could argue born out of the landfill struggle. So when the city and county decided to propose building a landfill basically over the old town site near the river, there was a lot of mobilization in the local community across, I would argue, racial and class lines that might have separated people in the community before, to really become politically active against that. And in a lot of ways, the history of Quindaro was elevated as a result. And they used history as an argument to deny the building of that landfill in that location, which was ultimately successful. In fact, if you read in the journal, numerous state laws were actually changed as a result of this activism to prevent landfills from ever being that geographically close to a river or a waterway. And I think it's that work, so now we're decades away from that, where people really started to want to get some official preservation of the community to bar any kind of desecration like that in the future. The sad thing is some of that landfill pre-work destroyed some of the ruins that had been there for over a century by that point that are now no longer there or difficult to see. But I think you can draw a straight line from that landfill activism, or I guess anti-landfill activism, to the designation as a national commemorative site, which Quindaro received in 2019. There is still ongoing work to get National Historic Landmark status, which is a separate status. The commemorative site status is one given by Congress. This is actually a fairly new process, and Quindaro is only the second commemorative site named by Congress under this legislation, which is a really big deal. And it's been an important way of tying together politicians in the region with the local community. And one of the things that allows is that the site can now have access to federal funding through the National Park Service and other programs to preserve and to interpret. So if you've ever been to the Quindaro ruins or overlook, there's a National Park Service overlook there. That's where the picture on the front of the journal issue comes from. That's been there for a while. And then there is ongoing work right now since this designation last year to find other ways to dedicate federal resources to the preservation. And I think that's really exciting. I think in the next few years, you're going to see actual physical changes over in that area that speak to federal investment in this preservation. And I think that's really exciting. And if they got national landmark status at some point in the future, that would also lead to other resources they could use to preserve and celebrate the history of that location.
Is there any current work going on at the site? And if so, is there a way for people to get involved?
Yeah, there is current work going on there. The most pressing need right now is to stabilize the ruins that remain. As Tai mentioned, some of the buildings were damaged back during the landfill development that was ultimately aborted back in the 1980s. But there are still quite a few remaining, and they have some great archaeological significance. Marvin Robinson, whom Tai mentioned earlier, refers to Quindaro as the Pompeii of Kansas. And if you go down there and have a look, it is really awesome. It really does take you back to a much earlier period. And of course, the landscape has changed. The river's course has changed a little bit. So you're not exactly looking at the same terrain as you would have 160 years ago. Unfortunately, what also happened in the 1980s is that when some of these ruins were first exposed to the elements because of the development, they're now in a state of accelerating decline. So the most pressing need is to get those ruins stabilized and prevent them from collapsing any further. That does require monetary resources, and the attempt to get National Landmark Historic status would certainly help with that. Beyond the stabilizing of those ruins, the next step that we're looking at is to develop historic trails. So we would like for Quindaro to be developed to a place one day where people can easily walk from one site to the other and see where the old brewery was or where the newspaper offices were located, or you can see the home of this or that founder of Quindaro. And on this trail, there would also be historic signs which would explain to casual visitors really what went on there. So these are not hard things to do. They've been accomplished with great ease in other places, like here in Johnson County. I think what people with a casual interest in this could probably do best is first simply be aware that Quindaro exists. And secondly, don't be afraid to go down there. The place has this reputation of being in the inner city as a dangerous spot to visit, and I think the locals are very insulted by that. Quindaro is a terrific site to just go and visit. You want to go on a nice day when it's not muddy and you want to take your good hiking shoes. But it really is a step back in time to those days when the Missouri River meant a real demarcation between two different ways of life. Beyond that, I would just encourage people to stay informed about what's happening with the community.
And so, if either of you had to identify one key point or takeaway about Quindaro for our listeners and readers, what would it be?
Well, I would say for me, and Jim has touched on this, it's really invisibility. I didn't really know about Quindaro's history, and certainly not in the way that this journal issue documents, until Jim got me involved with the symposium before it took place. And then when I was at the symposium, I had a familiar feeling of deep rage of not knowing about these diverse histories of Kansas and these alternative narratives of Kansas. Native Kansas or indigenous Kansas is often relegated to a very specific narrative in our history. And the Wyandottes and their relationship with abolitionists in informing this town really dispels a lot of those myths. And then the invisibility of Black urban and semi-urban or semi-rural Americans is not a big part of our Kansas history either. And I think a super tragedy is Western University should be something any native Kansan, someone born and raised and educated in Kansas, should be able to rattle off easily. That should be something as easy as a Free State narrative to me, especially because it was the first HBCU west of the Mississippi River. It existed for such a long period. It was really important in Black history. It was funded by the state. It was really important, and it has a lot of significance in educating a lot of very prominent African Americans across American history thereafter. And it's just something we should be able to speak to. And it's no wonder that the local community was enraged that someone wanted to build a landfill on top of it. We all should have been enraged. And so I think hearing this story speaks to the narratives we privilege and the narratives we silence in Kansas history. And then, as Jim has talked about, I think as a result, even for local people who identify as being from Quindaro, the way they've had to tell their story is often latching on to those dominant narratives like Free State and abolitionism. And we are now at a point where we can tell a more complete history about all the people that have lived there. It was a diverse place. And the other word I would think of, I said invisibility. The second word I think of is intersection. It's the intersection of a lot of different themes of both Kansas and American history. And personally, when Jim and I were putting this journal issue of Kansas history together, one of my goals was that as a teacher, I could assign this journal from front to back and cover a very significant period of history, all tied around the theme of Quindaro. And that it would dispel a lot of these myths by starting earlier in time and coming into the present and dealing with the diverse people that live there and how they remember it.
I guess I have two key points that I would take away from my experience with Quindaro. One is that I think historians need to be paying more attention to the importance of local history. As I tell my students, you don't need to go back to 17th century Boston or 18th century South Carolina to understand what's happening in America. All the stories you need to pay attention to are happening right nearby you. Quindaro is right here, and again, it touches on so many of the major themes of American history. I guess my other takeaway, the key point that still lingers with me as I think about this, is the role of infrastructure. Quindaro was located on the river because of its strategic importance during the age of steamboat traffic. When railroads came into vogue, then the town went into economic decline. It had its resurgence in the 20th century, and then along came something called the interstate highway system in the 1950s and 60s that changed the way people moved, changed the whole transportation network. And there are many locals there today who say that the building of Highway 635 was a devastating blow to the town. So looking at it from the big picture, the role of transportation just seems crucial to me in all of this. And again, I think historians need to be paying some better attention to infrastructure.
When you think about Quindaro, I think some of the quotes from this journal volume, especially from Stacey Evans's piece at the beginning, sum up a lot of what Jim and I have been talking about. She says, "The first thing you notice when visiting Quindaro today is just how old everything still feels." She talks about up on the bluffs, the land is dotted with more houses and neighborhoods than an unfamiliarized eye will ever see. People still live in this area, which only very recently gained access to cable or internet. You're just as likely to see cars as horses riding down the local street. And I think one of the things that's interesting about Quindaro is in many ways, it exists as a unique location even inside of the community that it's in. And I really would encourage people to also focus on the piece that has the oral histories in it that speak to a lot of that diverse history of experience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leiker and Dr. Edwards, for talking with us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to learn more about the topics discussed on this podcast, consider becoming a subscriber to our journal, Kansas History, a journal of the Central Plains. Visit our webpage on the Kansas State University's Department of History website to learn how.